Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Thursday, Yom HaMishi. Let's light up the darkness. Welcoming Yehud, South Carolina, Paul in the Great Northwest, Michael in Culver City. That's a new name. I used to live in Culver City. Know it well. Melissa in Great Neck, Bella in Florida, Joe in the Inland Empire, Nancy in North Carolina, Shandora in the Bronx, Renee in Indiana, Sharon in New Jersey, Karen in Northern California, Bill is in Poplar Bluff, Missouri, where my mother lived. We'll be seeing her one last time as a family tomorrow and then holding the funeral proper on Saturday, where I'll be preaching prayers that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart may be acceptable in the sight of the Lord, are much appreciated, as our prayers for mom's repose and our grief. Oh yes, Bill, please God, may you be strengthened in this difficult time, you and all your family, and may the words of your mouth and the meditations of your heart bring strength and comfort and inspiration to everyone who will hear you as you speak on behalf and in memory of your mom, and let us say Amen. Welcoming also Belle in Texas, Herb in Denver, Guy in Ohio, Chaim in Florida, Ilanit in Silver Spring, Spencer in Connecticut, Debbie in New Jersey, Aoife in Florida. Welcome everybody. Reminder, we'll have class tomorrow at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific, and then no class Saturday night. Because we're going right into Tisha B'Av coming out of Shabbos, and no class Sunday because we'll still be in Tisha B'Av and fasting, and we're ahead anyway, and why not just go with the stringent opinion, which is you don't learn regular passages of Torah on Tisha B'Av, like regular program of study like Daf Yomi. You would study the portions of Torah and of the Bible and of the Gemara that are appropriate for the day of Tisha B'Av, but that's not our program. So tomorrow we'll have class, Friday at noon Pacific, and then the next class after that will be Monday at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific. Okay, our daf today is page 46, and we've already done most of it. We did, although we'll get a head start on 47, but we're at the bottom of page 46a, where we pick it up, our discussion of Mishnah number 6, right? Mishnah 6? Mishnah number 6 here in chapter 3. And the Mishnah, right, was all about if an idolater worships a mountain, does he render that mountain prohibited for our use, for our benefit? Now that some idolater worship the mountain, does that mean that a Jew can't hike on that mountain, can't farm on that mountain? No, he does not render it prohibited because he had no involvement with the creation of it. If he covered it in gold plate for the purpose of his idolatry, we would not be permitted to benefit from that gold, right? That was dedicated to and used in the practice of idolatry, so that would render it prohibited for us. Okay, bottom, and now we're related matters, right? Does the fact that some idolater worshipped an object or an animal render it prohibited for us? These are the kind of questions we're examining. Rami Bar Chama raises a dilemma. In the case of one who bows down to a mountain, what is the law with regard to the permissibility of using its stones for building the altar in the temple, right? So the altar in the temple, we know it has to be made of stones that are not cut, right? You can't have a sword or an iron implement cut those stones, of which the altar is built, on which we bring sacrifices to the Most High. Yesterday we were talking about, and we didn't really get a final answer on if boulders were dislodged on that mountain, would they be rendered prohibited or not? But the general consensus seemed to be no. The person who worshipped those boulders did not, contribute to creating them. They were created by God. If he cut them, that probably would be something else. If he fabricated a brick, set that up for idolatry, that certainly would be prohibited to us. Okay, so somebody worshipped some stones. He didn't create them. Now, different question. So it sounds like he worshipped the stones. He didn't create the stones. The stones were already there. They weren't his stones. He didn't render them prohibited. For us, we could use those stones, to make a fence around the field. But could we use such stones in the holy temple to help construct the altar on which Jewish sacrifices would be brought? This is obviously only when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. Are we going to be more stringent when we're talking about using such stones for the altar versus just using them for regular mundane purposes? Now we're on 46b. So the Gemara explains the dilemma. An animal that was worshipped is rendered unfit to be sacrificed as an offering in the temple, right? The fact that the idolater worshipped this animal won't render it prohibited for our use, right? Especially if it's not his animal, but it would render it unfit to be brought as a sacrifice. So seems like there's higher standards, and that makes sense, right? Because an animal that is in a state of tuma, ritual impurity, doesn't render it unfit for eating. We can eat such an animal. A priest can't if that animal is teruma, a tithing for priests only, which has to be eaten in a state of purity, and the priest himself has to be in a state of purity. But if we're not priests, and we're just eating the animal for regular dining, that's okay. It can be impure. But an animal that is impure cannot be brought up on the altar as a sacrifice. So there are obviously more stringent requirements for what is brought on the altar. Therefore, what about creating the altar itself? Right? An animal that was worshipped is rendered unfit to be sacrificed as an offering in the temple. Now, the Gemara previously established a principle that objects attached to the ground are not rendered forbidden by idol worship. The question here is, with regard to an item that is attached to the ground and that was worshipped by an idolater, is it rendered unfit for the Most High, i.e. for the temple, just like an animal would be rendered unfit? Or is the law that with regard to an item that is attached to the ground and that was worshipped, it is not rendered unfit for the Most High, just as it is not forbidden with regard to an individual's regarding personal benefit from it? Furthermore, if you say that with regard to an item that is attached to the ground and that was worshipped by an idolater, it is rendered unfit for the Most High, are the items that merely facilitate the sacrifice of an offering, such as the altar, viewed the same way as an offering itself, or not? Perhaps the principle that items worshipped in idolatrous practice are disqualified for use in the temple applies only to the offerings themselves, which are sacrificed as a pleasing aroma to the Lord. But the accoutrement of those sacrifices, in this case the altar itself, perhaps doesn't have such a stringent requirement that it never have been used in this way. Rava says the dilemma can be resolved with a kal v'chomer inference, often translated using a Latin term, a fortiori. Latin or Greek, I can't remember. The Torah prohibits the sacrifice of an animal as an offering or a donation to the temple if it was given in payment to a prostitute or exchanged in the sale of a dog. Right? So in other words, if a prostitute was paid with an animal, and then she wanted, or someone wanted, or she gave to somebody else, or sold to someone else, that animal, which was then going to be used as an offering in the Holy Temple, there's an explicit Torah law in the written Torah that says, no, you can't do that. An animal that was ever exchanged for the hire of a prostitute is forever disqualified to be brought as an offering in the Holy Temple. Likewise, an animal that was given in exchange for a dog, the price of a dog. That's Deuteronomy 23:19. And in this case, there is no difference whether the payment is unattached to the ground, and there is no difference whether it is attached. right? Whether you gave an animal as a payment for the prostitute or you gave a tree in payment for a prostitute, it becomes disqualified to ever then, I guess you couldn't then sell the tree and use the proceeds to pay for an offering that would be brought in the Holy Temple. So there's no difference whether this payment for the prostitute was attached to the ground or not attached to the ground. It becomes forbidden in a case, concerning an object. Let me just read this whole sentence again so we can keep track. And if it is so that concerning deriving benefit from an item that served as payment to a prostitute, which is permitted to an ordinary person, right? That sheep, you could slaughter it and barbecue it and eat it. It's only prohibited to bring as an offering in the temple. Even in a case where the item is detached to the ground, and nevertheless, such an item is forbidden to use for the Most High, even in a case where it is attached to the ground, as it is written, you shall not bring the payment to a prostitute or the price of a dog into the house of the Lord your God for any vow, where there is no difference whether the payment is unattached to the ground, and it's no different if it is attached to the ground. Then, concerning an object that was worshipped in idolatrous practice, which is rendered forbidden in a case where it is detached from the ground, even for the use of an ordinary person, prohibited for benefit, obviously prohibited as an offering, is it not logical that it should be prohibited to use it for the Most High, even in the case of an object that was attached to the ground when it was worshipped? So Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, said to Rava, before he gives the answer, he could almost say, yeah, that was a very complicated, multi-step process to arrive at the Kal V'chomer, and because there were so many logical steps in it, there's going to be room to challenge it. And here's how he challenges it. Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, said to Rava, or one can reverse the claim, and if an object that was worshipped by an idolater, which is forbidden in a case where it is detached from the ground, even for the use of an ordinary person, and yet it is permitted for use even for the Most High in a case where it is attached to the ground, as it is stated that the mitzvah is to destroy their gods upon the high mountains, but not the mountains themselves, but not the mountains themselves that are their gods, and therefore with regard to such items there is no difference between use for an ordinary person and use for the Most High. Then concerning payment to a prostitute, which is permitted for use of an ordinary person in the case of a detached item, is it not logical that it should be permitted to use for the Most High in a case where the payment is an item that was attached to the ground? Now listen, there is no question that if it ever came up, even if we at the end of this chain of logic and logical inferences, we would determine that a stone, that was worshipped by an idolater or that was, used as payment for a prostitute, even if the law came out that it would be permitted to use such a stone in the construction of the altar, but that was known, we wouldn't do it, right? We wouldn't do it. This is not based on what we would do in the real world. We would just want to remove any trace of idolatry, even if it was permitted, once we went through all the logical inferences. But that's not why they're asking the question. The reason they're asking the question is so that we can sharpen our understanding of what does the law in the Torah say, what does it cover, and what does it not cover. So let's make sure we understand that. Okay. So Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, continues. And if one would say that it should still be prohibited to use it in the temple due to that verse that states, you shall not bring the payment to a prostitute or the price of a dog into the house of the Lord your God, which indicates a blanket prohibition, whether attached or detached from the ground when it was paid to the prostitute. This verse is already necessary to teach a different law, namely that which is taught in a baraisa. The phrase into the house of the Lord your God excludes its use as a red heifer, which is not brought to the temple. Rather, it is sacrificed outside the city on the Mount of Olives. This is the statement of Rabbi Eliezer. And the rabbis say, no, this phrase is stated to include the prohibition against hanging in the temple beaten plates of gold that were used in the payment of a prostitute. Even though they are not used in the temple service, it is prohibited even to hang them as a decoration in the temple. That is how far-reaching the prohibition on using any item that was, used as payment for a prostitute to bring it into the temple for any reason whatsoever. Rava said to Rav Huna, the son of Rav Yehoshua, I am stating a kal v'chomer inference that leads to a stringency. And you are stating a kal v'chomer inference that leads to a leniency. And the principle is that where there is an option to employ a kal v'chomer inference that leads to a leniency or one that leads to a stringency, we infer the stringency. And you can see why. We don't want to use these convoluted step-by-step logical inferences to arrive at a situation where we permit something that would otherwise not be permitted. We might use such a thing to lead to a stringency, because that's only going to take us further away from coming to commit a sin. But if it's going to be a leniency, right, which might draw us closer to something that is actually prohibited if we're getting the logic wrong, we don't go there. Rav Papa said to Rava, and is it so that anywhere that there is an option to employ a kal v'chomer inference to infer a leniency or a stringency, we do not infer the leniency? But isn't there the case of sprinkling the purifying water of the red heifer upon one who has contracted tuma, ritual impurity, through contact with a human corpse, like somebody who participated in a burial, right? When the temple is standing, he can't enter the temple until, we've gone over this so many times, until what? Until he goes through the 7-day purification process, which includes being sprinkled with the water that contains the ashes of a red heifer on the 3rd and 7th day. And then on the 7th day, he immerses in a mikvah, I guess after the sprinkling with the ashes of the red heifer. He immerses in the mikvah. Then he waits for nightfall. And then he will be permitted to enter the temple. Okay, that's purification from contact with a human corpse. What about it? But isn't there the case of sprinkling the purifying water of the red heifer upon one who contracted tumas mace, right, to ritual impurity through contact with a corpse, in order to thereby obligate him in the sacrificing and eating of the Pesach, right? Somebody, when the temple is standing, who has become tameh and cannot become tahor, ritually pure, in time for Passover, what's going to happen to him? He's going to have to bring the Pesach, right, and eat and partake of the Paschal lamb a month later, Pesach sheini. But that's not preferable. So if there's a chance that he can become purified in time for Passover, that's what he should do. So what is the case that they're talking about here? The case is Passover begins Sunday night, right? He can become purified on the 7th day of his tumas mace on Shabbos. So can he be sprinkled with the waters of that contain the ash of the red heifer on Shabbos, immerse in the mikvah, wait for nightfall, and then he's going to be pure, and then he can eat the Pesach along with his group that's going to eat it that night? Sounds great. What's the problem? The rabbis, by rabbinic decree, prohibited being sprinkled with the water that contains the ashes of the red heifer, the waters of sprinkling, on Shabbos. By rabbinic decree, not by Torah law, by rabbinic decree. Why would they do that? I'm sure it was something like people might come to carry the water, in a way that violates Shabbos, and other policy considerations to draw a fence around the Torah. So I don't remember exactly what the reason is right now. I'm sure that's involved in it. But the point is, there is a rabbinic decree that we don't sprinkle on Shabbos. Well, do we say that we're going to override that rabbinic decree so that this guy can fulfill the Torah commandment of eating the Pesach in its time when Passover begins Sunday night? Right? That's the two competing principles here. But isn't there the case of sprinkling the waters of sprinkling the waters of purification to render him obligated to eat the Pesach? As Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Akiva disagree with regard to whether it is permitted to do this on Shabbos, each of them employing a kal v'chomer inference to support his opinion. Rabbi Eliezer holds that a stringency should be inferred, and he thereby deems the man obligated to purify himself and bring the Pesach, even if he can purify himself only by doing it on Shabbos. Right? So Rabbi Eliezer says he's obligated in the Torah commandment of eating the Pesach on time, and that's going to override the rabbinic decree to not sprinkle on Shabbos. And Rabbi Akiva infers a leniency and exempts him from the obligation to bring the Pesach in its time, and therefore we don't override the Shabbos prohibition, and that's going to mean that he's excused from bringing the Pesach on that Sunday night. That's the leniency that is meant by Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva infers a leniency and exempts him from the obligation to bring the offering. And clearly, contrary to Rabba's claim, Rabbi Akiva infers a leniency. How is this a kal v'chomer? Let's keep reading. This is as we learned in a Mishna in Tractate Pesachim, page 65b, that Rabbi Eliezer, the one who would say, no, he should sprinkle on Shabbos and bring the Pesach Sunday night, Rabbi Eliezer reasoned, here's the kal v'chomer, if a shechita, right, slaughtering an animal, which is generally prohibited on Shabbos by Torah law, we don't draw blood on Shabbos, is nevertheless permitted for the sake of sacrificing the Pesach, which we would do on that Sabbath afternoon before Pesach begins Sunday night, right? All the more so is it not clear that sprinkling the purifying water of the red heifer, which is prohibited on Shabbos merely due to a rabbinic decree, should override Shabbos. Rabbi Akiva replied, no, because we could reverse the claim. And if sprinkling the purifying water on Shabbos, which is prohibited merely due to rabbinic decree, does not override Shabbos, then with regard to slaughter, which is prohibited by Torah law, all the more so is it not clear that it should not override Shabbos. So contrary to Rava's claim, Rabbi Akiva clearly infers a leniency instead of the stringency inferred by Rabbi Eliezer. Now, it's an interesting argument because what really is the leniency and what is the stringency? The ultimate result, right, is that according to Rabbi Eliezer, we have to be stringent so that he can bring the Pesach Sunday night, and Rabbi Akiva is excusing him from bringing the Pesach on Sunday night. But in order to render him obligated to bring the Pesach, it almost sounds like Rabbi Eliezer is being more lenient with regard to Shabbos, and Rabbi Akiva is being more stringent with regard to Shabbos. Right? It's an interesting case of how we're balancing this out. Now the Gemara answers there, Rabbi Akiva does not employ a real kal v'chomer inference. Rabbi Eliezer himself taught him this law, which he knew as a tradition. But Rabbi Eliezer had forgotten his own learning, and Rabbi Akiva came to remind him of it by drawing a kal v'chomer inference that would cause Rabbi Eliezer to remember that which he himself had taught. And so the Gemara offers a support for this interpretation from the continuation of that discussion in Tractate Pesachim, which is recorded in a Baraisa. And this is what Rabbi Akiva said to him, my teacher, do not deny my contention at the time of judgment, i.e. during deliberation of this matter, as this is the tradition that I receive from you. Sprinkling is prohibited by rabbinic decree, and it does not override Shabbos. So really why this whole discussion was brought down was to say, are we going to allow a kal v'chomer inference when there's a choice how the kal v'chomer is drawn to create a leniency or a stringency? Are we going to allow it to create a leniency? Well, it sounds like, no, we're not going to allow it to create a leniency. We only use it for a stringency. It seemed like it created a leniency based on that long story, but in the end we see we don't follow Rabbi Akiva's argument in that, or we do. I'm confused now. Or we do, right? So Rabbi Eliezer would have to concede to Akiva, therefore we don't override Shabbos in order to allow this guy to be obligated in the Pesach, which sounds like it's a leniency, but I still say it's not really a leniency. It's more of a stringency that we don't override Shabbos. Okay, new subject. Rami Bar Chama raises a dilemma in the case of one who bows to a stalk of wheat. Back to Avoda Zara, our topic of our tractate. An idolater looks at a stalk of wheat and calls it his god, and he bows down to it. Has he rendered that stalk of wheat prohibited? Very low stakes. It's just one stalk of wheat. But, so, we attempted to say, yeah, just render it prohibited. We don't want to have anything to do with it since he bowed down to it. But we've already seen the principle that something that is attached to the ground, even if idolater worships it, it doesn't render it prohibited because it's still attached to the ground, like in the case of a whole mountain. So what's happening here? In the case of one who bows to a stalk of wheat, what is the law with regard to using it for meal offerings? He doesn't render it prohibited for a Jew to make bread out of that wheat and eat it with his dinner. But are we going to be more stringent when we're talking about meal offerings, right? Wheat that is used to make a bread or a dough that is actually burned on the holy altar as an offering. Are we going to be more stringent and say, well, if it had any kind of connection to idolatry, we don't want to bring it as a meal offering in the temple? Does the wheat lose its forbidden status after it is ground into flour or not? Now, new question. We're talking about boulders, stones that don't get cut if they're fashioned into the altar. Right? We're talking about mountains. Mountains don't change. Animals, an animal, whether an idolater worships it or not, is still an animal. But wheat that's growing on the stalk, when it gets harvested and then ground into flour, that is a fundamental transformation of its state. It is a new product now. It's made of wheat, obviously, but now that it's flour, it's a different substance than when it was, raw wheat or even growing wheat, uncut. So is this going to make a difference? Does a change in the form of a worshipped object revoke its forbidden status? Or does it change in the form of a worshipped object, right, that was worshipped by an idolater, not revoke its forbidden status? Mar Zutra, the son of Rav Nachman, said, come in here, a resolution from that which is taught in a Mishna, Tractate Temura 30b. The principle is that concerning all items that are forbidden with regard to sacrificing them on the altar, their offspring, i.e. whatever products are derived from them, are permitted. As it is taught with regard to this Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer deems the offspring forbidden. Right? So we've seen this kind of discussion before, an ox that gored. Right? Now that ox stands to be stoned because it killed a person. There's going to be a trial on that ox, and then it's going to be executed. But while it's awaiting trial, after it gored, what if it becomes impregnated and gives birth to a calf? Can that calf be kept? Right? Can it be kept by its owner, or does it stand condemned to be executed also? Is it different if the ox was pregnant, the cow was pregnant, when it killed a person by trampling a person? Is that a different outcome? Right? Similar analysis here. When we talk about offspring and whether it's permitted or not. So the Gemara asks, but wasn't it stated with regard to this dispute that Rav Nachman says that Rabba Bar Avu says the dispute is with regard to a case where it became prohibited to use the animals as offerings because a person engaged in bestiality with them, and later they became pregnant, right? Similar to an ox that gored. An ox that was used in bestiality also is going to be executed. Sad, the ox didn't do anything to be abused by a human, but bestiality is so horribly sinful that the person who commits the bestiality is subject to the death penalty. Obviously, there has to be warnings, witnesses, all of that. And then the animal stands to be put down as well. So what about if that animal is a female that is pregnant, right, and has a fetus within it, let's say a calf, and then the question would be, of course, when did the calf come into the picture? Was it before the bestiality happened or after the bestiality happened? Let's keep reading. Now we're on page 47a. But if they became pregnant later, if they became pregnant and later a person engaged in bestiality with them, all agree that the offspring are forbidden because the offspring was involved in the act of bestiality, even if in the fetal state. It was present in that animal when it was the subject of bestiality. So it's like the two animals were the subject of bestiality, right? The mother and its fetus. And here too, in the case of wheat, the case of the wheat is similar to the case where they became pregnant and later a person engaged in bestiality with them because the flour was also worshipped, flour, F-L-O-U-R, albeit in the form of a stalk of wheat. Right? So we're saying that, okay, the idolater would not render the stalk of wheat prohibited for a Jew to just, bake it into bread, but he would render it prohibited to be brought as a meal offering in the holy temple. And what is the reason for that? Must be that even though it's still attached to the ground, the fact that the wheat kernels were on that stalk, it's like as if a pregnant cow was the subject of bestiality, and that calf is also going to be prohibited when, with respect to bringing offerings, the kernels of wheat flour on the stalk are like a fetus, right? A potential meal offering was on that stalk, and that's going to be enough to disqualify it from being brought as an offering in the temple. According to this view, we're not done yet. Okay, there are those who say that Mar Zutra himself quoted Rav Nachman's statement. The dispute is with regard to a case where it became prohibited to use the animals as offerings because a person engaged in bestiality with them, and later they became pregnant. Right, so that would suggest that the cow was already condemned, but the fetus was not present at the time of the bestiality. But a cow condemned to be executed because it was used in bestiality later became pregnant. So does that offspring of a condemned animal also become condemned or not? But if they became pregnant and then the bestiality happened, all agree that the offspring would be forbidden. Sounds like if the condemned cow became pregnant later, that's where the disagreement is, whether the offspring is prohibited or permitted. And these stalks of wheat as well are similar to the case where they became pregnant and later the person engaged in bestiality with them because at the time the idolater worshipped the stalk of wheat, the wheat kernels were already there. So the Gemara asks, how can these cases be compared? There in the case of the offspring that is prohibited to be brought to be there in the case of the offspring that is prohibited to bring as an offering, it was initially an animal in its fetal state, and now it is still an animal. A fetus is treated as a full-fledged animal, and the opening of the womb is compared to a closed door that holds it in its place. But here, in the case of the wheat flour, it was initially wheat, and now it is flour. Right? When the wheat kernels were on the stalk, that was wheat. Later, when the stalk is harvested and the wheat is ground into flour, that's not the same. That is it's been processed, and the change is fundamental enough that we would say this is a new item, and therefore its status as the object of idolatry has been revoked. It is a totally new form. Therefore, no proof can be derived from the Mishnah. We haven't proven whether it can be used or not, but we're distinguishing between wheat that has been turned into flour that's different than a fetus that was born. New subject. Reish Lakish raises a dilemma. And so that was left unresolved. Reish Lakish raises a dilemma. In the case of one who bows, right? So the idea is, we don't know yet if an idolater worships a stalk of wheat, if those wheat kernels could later be processed into flour, and that flour could be used to bring a meal offering in the temple. We wouldn't do it, because we could find other wheat to bring as a meal offering in the temple. But at the technical legal question, we haven't solved yet. We're moving on to a new question. Reish Lakish raises a dilemma. In the case of one who bows to a palm tree, right? An idolater worships a palm tree. What is the law with regard to its lulav, the palm branch? Is it permitted to use a lulav cut from it for the mitzvah of lulav that we wave on the holiday of Sukkot? Now, maybe we would say, okay, well, offerings that are brought on the altar in the Holy Temple, we have to be, maximum stringent. And so if it had any contact with Avoda Zara, with idolatry at all, it's disqualified. But here, and we know that if an idolater bows to a palm tree, he hasn't rendered that palm tree prohibited for our use. We could harvest the dates, we could make date honey or date beer, or use the leaves for just standard mundane purposes. Okay, but what about for a mitzvah? The mitzvah of lulav on Sukkot. Does the idolater render the leaves of that palm tree prohibited to be used for the mitzvah of lulav on Sukkot? So now the Gemara narrows down the dilemma. With regard to a tree that was initially planted for idolatry, you don't have a dilemma. In that case, the law is clear, as it is prohibited to use it even for an ordinary non-mitzvah purpose. Right? The tree was planted for the purpose of idolatry. It's utterly prohibited for a Jew to derive any benefit from it. We must therefore be talking about a tree that was planted for mundane purposes. I mean, just for regular purposes. He's a date farmer. Then an idolater comes along and worships the tree. Obviously, he's not going to render it prohibited because the tree was already there and attached to the ground. But are we going to be more stringent when it comes to using that leaf for a mitzvah? Right? So if it was planted for idolatry, we can't use it. Rather, raise the dilemma with regard to a tree that was planted and then subsequently an idolater came along and worshipped it. And do not raise the dilemma, according to the opinion of Rabbi Yosef Bar Yehuda, who holds that even for an ordinary purpose, it is forbidden. That's a minority opinion. Rather, when should you raise this dilemma? Raise it according to the majority opinion of the rabbis, who hold that such a tree that was planted by a Jew for his use, an idolater came along and worshipped it, he does not render the tree forbidden. But what about to use its leaf for a mitzvah? What is the law with regard to using the lulav from such a tree that was worshipped for this mitzvah? Is it nevertheless forbidden because it is considered repulsive to use such a lulav for the Most High, i.e. for a mitzvah on Sukkot, or not? That's the question. When Rab Dimi came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he presented a different understanding of Reish Lakish's dilemma. He said, Reish Lakish raises the dilemma with regard to an Asherah, so that's a tree that idolaters planted for idolatrous purposes, whose status as an object of idol worship was revoked. An idolater planted the tree to worship it, but then the idolater revoked its status as an object of idolatry. He said, he said, this is no longer idolatrous. This is no longer my God. He gave up his idolatry, at least with respect to that tree, right? We said that a Jew cannot revoke an idol from the realm of idolatry, but the idolater can. So this case is an Asherah that was revoked. So now, what is the dilemma? It's like this. Is there disqualification with regard to mitzvahs, or is there no disqualification with regard to mitzvahs? This lulav was once unfit for the mitzvah, since it was worshipped while it was attached to the tree that the idolater worshipped. Does that mean that these leaves are permanently disqualified, i.e. it can never be rendered fit? Or is the law that there is no permanent disqualification with regard to mitzvahs, and consequently, when the idolater revoked the status of that tree as an object of idolatry, did he thereby render its leaves fit for use in the mitzvah of lulav on Sukkot? And now the Gemara suggests, resolve the dilemma from that which we learned in a Mishna, tractate Chulin, page 37a. With regard to one who slaughtered an undomesticated animal or a bird, kosher animals but not domesticated, and he is obligated to cover the blood, which is part of the requirements for slaughtering a kosher animal that is not a domesticated animal. He is obligated to cover the blood after the slaughter. If he covered the blood and it was then uncovered, he is exempt from the obligation to cover it a second time because he performed the mitzvah. But if the wind blew dust and covered the blood and no person was involved, he is obligated to cover it because he never performed the mitzvah of covering the blood after the slaughter. And Rabbi Bar Chana says that Rabbi Yochanan says the Mishnah taught that one is obligated to cover the blood after the wind covered it, only in a case where the blood was then exposed. But if it was not then exposed, he's exempt from the obligation to cover it. Right? Sounds like the wind came along and did the mitzvah for him. Okay, so that it got done. He doesn't have to do it unless the wind covered it and then uncovered it. And we discussed this issue and asked, right, this is the Gemara talking, we discussed the issue and asked, when the blood was then exposed, what of it? Why is one obligated to cover it a second time? Once it was disqualified, it should remain disqualified. When the wind covered the blood, the person was exempted from covering the blood. If so, even if the blood is subsequently uncovered, he should remain exempt. Why then is he obligated to cover the blood in that case? And Rav Papa says, that is to say that there is no disqualification with regard to mitzvahs. Once the cause of the exemption from the obligation is removed, one is once again obligated to fulfill the mitzvah. If so, Reish Lakish's dilemma is resolved. Sounds like when the idolater was worshiping the tree, its leaves were disqualified to be used as a lulav. But when the idolater removed the tree from idolatry, does this imply that therefore now its leaves become fit again for the mitzvah? But the Gemara rejects this suggestion. It is with regard to Rav Papa's resolution itself that Reish Lakish raised the dilemma. It is obvious to Rav Papa, based on the discussion with regard to covering the blood, that there is no disqualification with regard to mitzvahs, and there is no difference whether that ruling leads to leniency, as in the case of the worship tree, whose status as an object of idolatry was revoked, thereby permitting the lulav branch to be used for a mitzvah. And there is no difference whether that ruling leads to a stringency, as in the case of the blood, where one is obligated to cover it anew. These are different kinds of results, leniency versus stringency. Or perhaps, is he uncertain? And therefore, when the ruling leads to a stringency, we say that there is no disqualification with regard to mitzvahs, and one must perform the mitzvah again of covering the blood. But when that ruling leads to a leniency, we can't be so bold. So we do not say that there is no disqualification with regard to mitzvahs. And the Gemara concludes, the question shall stand. Teku, we haven't resolved it. Right? Again, when we have to use various logical leaps, the sages are going to be very reticent to use that complex argument to take something that would have been otherwise prohibited and render it permitted. A leniency. Rav Papa raises another dilemma. In the case of one who bows to an animal, right? So an idolater worships the animal, not sacrifices the animal to his statue, his god, but rather calls the animal his god and bows to it. In the case of one who bows to an animal, what is the law with regard to its wool? May it be used for techeles, right? So tzitzis on our garments, we're supposed to have the blue thread in it. That is a very holy mitzvah. Right? So if an idolater bows to an animal, right? The animal was created by God, essentially. So the idolater bowing to the animal does not render the animal prohibited. If the idolater slaughtered the animal to his God, we would not be permitted to eat its meat. But the fact that the idolater bowed to the animal, does not render it prohibited for us to, slaughter it, cook it, have barbecue with it. Would render the animal prohibited to be brought as an offering on the altar in the Holy Temple when the temple is standing in Jerusalem. Now, the in-between question. The idolater bowed to the animal. Are we going to say that its wool would that become prohibited for use in the mitzvah of techeles, the sky blue wool in our ritual fringes? That's the question. The Gemara asks the techeles in question for which mitzvah? If it is the techeles for the ritual garments worn by Kohanim, by the priests in the Holy Temple, who are involved in bringing offerings to the Most High on the altar, etc., that's going to be a more stringent situation than just everyday techeles that I wear on my tzitzis, right? So if it is a techeles for the ritual garments worn by priests, then Rav Papa's dilemma is the same as the dilemma raised by Rami Bar Chama earlier with regard to the use in the temple of worshipped items that have since changed form. And if the techeles in question is for the mitzvah of tzitzis, for a regular person, This is the same as the dilemma raised by Reish Lakish with regard to the use of a branch of a worship palm tree for the lulav, which is outside the temple, but is still a mitzvah. So the Gemara answers, yes, it is indeed so that Rav Papa did not need to raise this dilemma as it was previously addressed. Whether we're talking about for priests, it's been answered, or if we're talking about it for techelis, or a regular tzitzis, it's the same question as the lulav from the palm tree. Although we didn't get to a final resolution on it. Let's keep reading. Yes, it is indeed so that Rav Papa did not need to raise this dilemma, as the dilemma was already raised. And the reason that he raises this dilemma is due to other matters that he needed to clarify concerning the use of parts of a worshipped animal in the song of the Levites in the holy temple. With regard to its wool, what is the law concerning using it for techelis that is used in the performance of a mitzvah? With regard to its horns, what is the law concerning their use for trumpets? With regard to the bones of its thighs, what is the law concerning their use for flutes? And with regard to its innards, what is the law concerning their use for harp strings? Right? Now we're getting a little bit further removed. If we use its wool for techelis, that's an explicitly written law in the Torah that we have to have sky blue, the dyed wool in our tzitzis, okay? But what he's asking is, idolater worshipped this goat, let's say. Can we use its horns as a shofar or a horn, the trumpet, that is used for the music that accompanies the song of the Levites in the holy temple? That's not an explicit mitzvah that there are Levite musicians playing music in the holy temple. It was part of the beauty and grandeur of the temple, but nowhere does the Torah say you shall have Levites playing this music. Likewise, if we're going to, from the bones, make flutes for those instruments, or from its gut, we're going to make strings on the harps that the Levites play. So what is this going to turn on? How is this a mitzvah itself, the Levites playing music, or is this just a beautification of the mitzvah? There is a mitzvah to have music in the holy temple. But what is the mitzvah itself? Is it the songs that are being sung, which are these just accompanied by these instruments? Or are the instruments of the Levites actually a mitzvah? According to the one who says that the primary element of song in the temple is the accompaniment by musical instruments, do not raise the dilemma, as it is certain that use of a worshipped animal would be prohibited, because the musical instruments are items used to facilitate an offering. It's a mitzvah to have music playing in the holy temple when offerings are being brought. It's part of the process of bringing offerings. Therefore, if the primary aspect of that song is the instruments of the Levites, no, those instruments can't be made of any animal that was worshipped by an idolater. So when should you raise the dilemma? Raise it according to the opinion of the one who says that the primary element of song in the temple is singing with the mouth, the choir of the Levites, which were accompanied by instruments, and that the musical instruments were merely to sweeten the sound, i.e. to accompany and enhance the singing. And accordingly, can one bring musical instruments made of worshipped animal parts as they are not an essential element of the temple service, or perhaps it is nevertheless forbidden, since it is repulsive to use such instruments in the course of the temple service? And the Gemara concludes, Teku, this question shall stand unresolved. We don't know the answer to that question. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. Finally, Rava raises a dilemma. In the case of one who bows to a spring of water, what is the law with regard to using that water for libations in the holy temple? And the Gemara asks, what is the dilemma he is raising? If we say that the dilemma concerns whether he is bowing to his own reflection, or perhaps he is bowing to the water itself, why then is this a dilemma only with regard to libations in the temple? Let him raise a dilemma with regard to the use of a pail of water that a person bowed to even for ordinary purposes. Right? If he bowed to the water, it's like he created an idol, so we can't use that water. We can go find other water. The Gemara answers, actually, it is clear that he is bowing to the water itself, and this is the dilemma that Rava raises. Is he bowing to the water before him, and therefore it follows that the first waters, i.e. those that were present at the time of his bowing, they're gone because it's a spring that is ever flowing. And the water that is currently flowing would then be permitted because that's not what he bowed to. That's water that came along later. Or perhaps he is bowing to the flow of water, which would render it prohibited to use all the water that flows in that spring for libation. It would not be prohibited to drink from that spring because it's essentially attached to the ground, and he's not going to render the spring prohibited. Thank God, right? Because maybe we need that spring for drinking water. But since we have a higher level of holiness required for something that's brought as an offering in the Holy Temple, right? There are certain offerings that are accompanied by a water libation at Sukkot. Maybe he has rendered that spring prohibited to draw water from it to be used in water libations in the Holy Temple. And so the Gemara asks, and is the water actually rendered forbidden by his worship? But doesn't Rabbi Yochanan say in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Yechot Tzadok, water that belongs to the public cannot become forbidden? Good policy, right? Especially in a desert climate. And the Gemara answers, no, the dilemma is not with regard to the public spring. Rather, it is necessary with regard to a spring that flows from the ground in one specific location that is privately owned. That's the question, and they never answer. That is where the discussion ends of the discussion of Mishna number 6 here in chapter 3. And when we pick this up tomorrow at the regular Friday time, noon Pacific, we're going to open Mishna number 7 here in chapter 3. Some questions. A fortiori is Latin. Good. It sounded like Latin to me. Bill. Oh, speaking of the gold-plated mountain, I forgot to ask yesterday if there were such a mountain plated with gold for idolatry. While obviously Jews aren't permitted to benefit from it, but are they permitted to remove it from the mountain? After all, it can't be good for the mountain's ecosystem. It seems to me like absolutely. First of all, in Israel, for sure, you got to remove that gold, grind it into dust, and get rid of it. Outside of Israel, can we save the mountain by getting rid of the gold? Interesting question. I think the first answer to that would be, who is entitled to do that? The owner of the mountain, right? So in most countries, mountains are probably public land, right? So that would be the right, not of a Jew to come along and save it, but of the nation, or whoever the property owner is of that mountain. He has the right. Could he use a Jew? Could he hire a Jew to remove the gold plate? Why not? I think an interesting question would be, can the Jew earn a salary for removing the gold plate from the mountain? He's not really benefiting from the gold plate. That's going to be destroyed and gotten rid of. He's benefiting from the fact that there was a job to do to remove that gold plate and save the mountain. I'm not sure what the answer to that is. I think that's an interesting question. Mickey, with regard to stones of the altar, those stones were cut by a worm, right? You're talking about the stones of the Holy Temple. This is what our ancestors and the sages taught us, not by metal, not by swords, not by chisels. They were cut by worms. Yes, with regard to the stones that are the walls of the Temple Mount and of the temple itself. I believe that the stones that were used for the altar might not have been cut at all. But I'm not sure about that. Ifa, price of a dog, would refer to male prostitutes who were known as dogs. That makes sense in the context. Would it also refer to the price of an actual dog? I think so. I think that in this case they would read it in its plain meaning and not take actual money that was exchanged for a dog. This interpretation, I haven't heard it before. I think it's really interesting. I bet you're right. But I think it would not remove it from its plain meaning. Sharon, were they still sprinkling the purifying water in the time of these rabbis? Was the temple already destroyed by then? Depends, right? Hillel and Shammai, who are certainly sages that we refer to a lot in our studies in the Mishnah, did live during the temple. Akiva saw the destruction of the temple. Yochanan ben Zakkai saw the destruction of the temple. Rebbe, who redacted the Mishnah around the year 200, was not alive while the temple was standing. So it's during the times of the Mishnah that we had that transition from the temple was there to the temple was not there. The sages of the Gemara, who are learning and teaching in Bavel. I mean, there was a Jewish community in Bavel during this whole time, but when we're talking about the sages of the Gemara, for sure that's later, right? That's after the year 200. And Joseph, is this addressing worship of people? Self-worship. I mean, it's a really interesting question, right? So Pharaoh set himself up as a god and people worshipped him. But what would that mean? If an idolater worshipped a person, I think it's, he's not going to render that person prohibited. But what does it mean, prohibited? When we talk about animals, right, that the fact that the idolater worshipped the sheep doesn't prevent us from, shearing it and making clothes out of its wool, slaughtering it and eating it. It does prevent us from using, the meat or the wool in the holy temple, right? It would not be fit for the Most High because it had been the subject of idolatry. But if a person had been worshipped by an idolater and now are we prohibited? He's not going to render that person prohibited, right? If we're saying, could he become the slave of a priest now that he had been worshipped? I think that's an interesting question. I don't know. That's an interesting question. I have to think about it. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Friday, regular Friday time, noon Pacific. Have a great night.